So hello and welcome to the ASEM's virtual public lecture, The Lives and Death of Ethical AI. My name's Adrian Barnett. I'm an Associate Investigator with the Australian Research Centre for Excellence in Mathematical and Statistical Frontiers, with the acronym ASEMS, and a Professor of Statistics in the School of Public Health and Social Work at Queensland University of Technology. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work, the Turrbal and Yagara, as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be online today. I also know it's Remembrance Day, an important day to remember people who have died in wars. And we're delighted to welcome Ellen Broad presenting today as part of the series. Ellen is a writer, researcher and senior fellow with the 3A Institute, founded by distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell within the College of Engineering and Computer Sciences at the Australian National University. Ellen has spent more than a decade working in the technology sector in Australia, the UK and Europe in leadership roles spanning policy, standards and engineering for organisations including CSIRO's Data 61, the Open Data Institute in the UK, and as an advisor to the UK Cabinet Minister Elizabeth Truss. She's a frequent keynote speaker and writer on AI and governance issues, and has written for publications including The Guardian, New Scientist and Griffith Review. She's the author of Made by Humans, The AI Condition, which was included in the Best Australian Science Writing 2019 and runner-up in ACT Book of the Year 2019, and I've read it and heartily recommend it too. It's a very enjoyable read. And Ellen is a co-designer with the ODI Vice President Jenny Tennyson on the board game Datapolis, which is about open data that is being played in 19 countries. But just Ellen, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I noticed today that the Open Data Institute at their summit in the UK have launched an online version of Datapolis. So if you haven't already got a physical copy, which I'm sure many of you do, it looks like you can play a virtual desktop version of it now as well. So hopefully you can all see those slides. I wanted to start just by reiterating my thanks to Adrian for inviting me to participate in this lecture series, and to Rosanna, who did such a fabulous job pulling it together and corralling us all. And also just express my gratitude to those of you who are attending. I can see already so many names of people that I've previously worked with or had conversations with or published papers with or worked on projects with. And I'm just really flattered that you're taking time out of what are your own really busy schedules to listen to this. And I just frankly really hope I can do your attendance justice. I was saying to Adrian and Rosanna beforehand that I'm more nervous now that I realize so many people I admire are attending. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking you today from Ngunnawal country and Ngambri country in Canberra, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's NAIDOC week this week, and the theme is always was, always will be, acknowledging that First Nations people have occupied and cared for this continent for over 65,000 years. Distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, the founder of 3AI, has incredibly eloquent and thought-provoking stories about the world's first technologists that I can't do justice to here, but I did want to take a moment to pay my respects to anyone listening today who is of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, who are living descendants of those first technologists, which is just still kind of breathtaking to me. So before we go any further, I wanted to really quickly say a little bit about the 3A Institute, which is a transdisciplinary institute. I'm actually speaking to you from the middle of our demo day for our master's program, where our students are demoing the technical systems that they've built over the course of the year. I've seen an immersive soundscape involving bird noises. I've seen a smart blood insulin level monitor. I've seen a gamification of energy consumption in the home app, a smart tap, and also Fatboy Slim's Right Here, Right Now is playing on repeat outside my door for a reason I can't explain. So hopefully you don't hear that through the lecture as well, but it's just a really great day to be here at 3AI and kind of see what they've done. So kind of, I feel like whenever I'm asked to do these things now, I end up immediately thinking, well, why me? What am I doing here? And I know Adrian mentioned the book that I wrote, Made by Humans, and I'm really conscious that this book is often described as being about AI ethics. But I'm also really conscious that when I wrote it, from the outset in the introduction, I admitted upfront that I was really conflicted about writing in terms of AI ethics. I pointed to increased money for ethical AI and the commoditization of ethical AI. I was worried about ethics washing, and I was also worried about ethics bashing. And frankly, for me, thinking about someone who's been involved in the design of technologies, it made me uncomfortable to talk about these decisions and trade-offs in terms of what is ethical or moral, rather than kind of how we're held accountable, what our responsibilities are, because accountability is ultimately, I think, what we aim for across every industry, regardless of whether I might personally believe my own actions were morally justified. And so while you could say Made by Humans as a book is imbued with a kind of questioning process, there is an unearthing of the values and purposes shaping technology design. And looking at values and purposes is very much part of the process of ethical reasoning. Rarely ever in the book do I discuss the events of the book or the kinds of systems that I'm looking at explicitly in moral terms. And this is mainly because I'm not actually an ethicist, like so many of my colleagues. I know some of you on this call, because I recognize you are yourselves ethicists and philosophers. So I guess it kind of raises an immediate question, which is, why am I presenting a lecture on AI ethics? And part of that, I think, is because I ended up falling into AI and data ethics by way of some of the work that I was doing at the Open Data Institute. I lead authored the ODI's original data ethics canvas and white paper back in 2016 and 2017. Although this beautiful thing that you're looking at on the screen is something that my colleagues can take full credit for, because they continue to build on it and iterate it after I left the UK and moved back to Australia. So I ended up explicitly exploring ethical data use about 5 years ago as part of a broader job. However, like many of you, ethical reasoning has always been an implicit part of my job. Anyone on this call who's done work designing and implementing or changing or regulating complex systems, whether these are technical systems or otherwise, this process of ethical reasoning would be very familiar to your work, to you as well, where we are called upon to evaluate and prioritize individual, organizational, societal values and needs as part of making decisions. There's a lot of navigating trade-offs. There's a lot of trying to identify and forecast and mitigate potential harms. And that's all kind of part and parcel of a lot of different kinds of roles that involve designing, commissioning, deploying systems that have the potential to affect people's lives. I guess what makes me slightly unusual, specifically in the technology sector, and the kind of in this kind of implicit use of ethical reasoning in my past, is that I've sat inside the tech sector and this process, designing technical systems, wearing a lot of different hats. I started my career as a digital rights activist, or if I'm talking to government, I'd say a technology policy expert, where my job involved agitating for change from outside the system, organizing side events at UN and trade agreement negotiations. But then I started moving into digital project implementation with governments and cultural heritage institutions around the world. So I did a lot of work in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and a little bit in the Middle East. I've been the ministerial advisor, sitting inside the discussions with ministers and departments and stakeholders, looking at a strategic level what technology change looks like. And I've led engineering projects that are designing software and standards with the potential to change the way we as citizens share information about ourselves. And I guess now I'm an academic. So I guess what that means, and why I'm like, hopefully this is useful in the context of the rest of this talk, is my career has involved looking at these challenges from a number of different angles, because I know that something that's always motivated me personally is wanting to understand other actors who are involved in bringing a technical system into the world, what their needs and values are, how they view that system. I have always felt whenever I meet someone whose job I haven't done and I think, wow, that sounds like a really cool job, I need to do it and understand how they do it. It makes me better at navigating through complex problems. It enables empathy. So I've been quite deliberate in trying to perceive these problems from different perspectives. I'm also very acutely aware now that I'm in academia that makes me very hard to categorize neatly. Some of you might say that I'm just incredibly indecisive. But the fact that I've been in these different kinds of roles also shapes how I approach them and the kind of ethical reasoning that I go through. So I just wanted to kind of give that because I know that I'm an odd fit, particularly in an academic context. So what am I going to do today? Today, I'm going to focus on three things. I'm going to place recent waves in AI ethics in context, in a broader context. I'm going to reflect on what we've learned, and I'm going to identify areas for future exploration. And I apologize in advance if I cough or if I sniffle. I have a cold. Rosanna was very concerned about it when she heard me cough earlier. Hopefully, I'll get through this without coughing at all. So, and I'm conscious that I keep it at quite a high level, but I'm really happy in the questions to go into more detail in any of these areas with you in the Q&A. So I've kind of used the framing of waves of ethical AI to shape the first part of this talk, because I've noticed that language picked up in a few different pieces this year. And I'm going to kind of use that to build on other waves that I think came before the kind of years that we're looking at now. And one of the characterizations of waves I drew on is this really excellent article by Carly Kind, who is the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK, who wrote earlier this year about 3 waves of ethical AI occurring in the last 5 years. The first wave being the wave of principles, ethical frameworks, ethical principles for AI. The second wave being technical solutions for and technical mitigations for issues of bias and inaccuracy in technical systems. And the third wave being a wave that focuses on structural changes in the way that we build systems and asks broader questions like, outside of the ways that we can technically improve these systems, should we be building them at all? So talking about issues like power and equity and justice in relation to technical systems. This is kind of echoed in Frank Pasquale, who's another researcher and author that I really admire and drawn quite a lot in writing Made by Humans. He talked about 2 waves of algorithmic accountability that's still primarily focused on what Carly Kind would categorize as the move from second to third wave. The move from looking at this as essentially a complex technical problem to be solved to a structural societal issue, invoking notions of power imbalances and access to justice. And I'll touch a little bit on what I think we can learn from each of them in a moment. Me personally, I have kind of ridden all 3 of these waves. I remember in 2015 working in the UK as someone advising on the Cabinet Office's data science ethical framework. And this was about the time that we started talking about data ethics as the ODI. And it's important to note that at that time, 2014, 2015, most of the published data ethics frameworks or principles that we could find in order to support changes to these kinds of frameworks were primarily interested in confidentiality, privacy, protection of personal data. And I know, and I will go into some of these, that these discussions have been going on a lot longer, but you have to understand that at that point in time, 2014, 2015, as a non-profit outside of the research sector, we would primarily use the open web to search for information. we would look to what other governments were doing, what other nonprofits were doing, what industry was doing, and we really couldn't find much. It was right on the cusp of interest in a kind of broader approach to data ethics. So we ended up kind of essentially pushing the boat out a little bit on what would it mean to consider ethical data handling, particularly beyond just kind of protection of privacy and confidentiality of personal data. So that was kind of what we were interested in. Then, of course, over the next few years, we saw principles for artificial intelligence and principles for data just explode. This is just one example of a project that I picked up on a couple of years ago. This was a Berkman Klein Center study led by Jessica Field, which mapped ethical principles from governments, from major tech companies, from intergovernmental bodies, and picked out the kind of key elements of each. And you can already see that even between when we were kind of starting to fussing around in 2014, 2015, and seeing a lot of focus on privacy, you can see that by 2018, 2019, the language of professional responsibility has been introduced, transparency and explainability, accountability. We're kind of already developing a much more nuanced and sophisticated an appreciation for the ways in which the data that we use in complex systems using increasingly powerful computing techniques can be used in ways that affect people's lives. So that changed so quickly and in such a short space of time. We also have seen some of the challenges and stumbling blocks of the kind of period of ethical principles and aspirations. A number of tech companies appointed kinds of AI councils. Some now increasingly have real enforcement mechanisms, but this was one example where it was criticized for the makeup of its council and also the kind of effectiveness of its response. We've also seen to that second wave of ethical AI, an increasing deployment of toolkits and techniques and processes for identifying and mitigating issues of bias or disparity in the results of a predictive system, and attempts to introduce fairness. And fairness has itself become again, a wave of research, not only in computer science and statistics, but with contributions from law and social science, trying to understand what it means for a system's results to be fair and navigating the incompatibility of different quantitative definitions of fairness. It was, of course, this kind of focus on quantitative measures of fairness and ways of mitigating bias in systems that then kind of led or provoked the interest in the third wave as well. We've also seen, kind of as predicted in Made by Humans, but I think increasingly is the commoditization of ethical AI, selling services that purport to help you produce ethical outputs. This was just one from Google this year. But there have been a difference in the ways that we've commoditized AI ethics. If I was to describe how I have observed the commoditization of AI ethics, I'd say, on the one hand, there are organizations who are trying to equip teams and companies and governments with tools to help them ethically reason for themselves. So not alleviating for them the burden of navigating the complexities of designing systems that reduce harm for populations, essentially trying to increase their kind of critical, the tools that they have at their disposal to critically evaluate the effects of their projects. And those projects that attempt to solve or offer the solution for an ethical dilemma that they're having, I don't believe it is possible to come to solutions for complex projects and be able to say that they are ethical in an objective sense of the word, because it is a personal and moral approach. I think that we are starting to coalesce around behaviors and practices that we talk about as being responsible, as being accountable practices. But that's where I see the difference between those approaches to commoditizing AI ethics. Those that are trying to help equip organizations with practices, tools, techniques to help them hold themselves to account without necessarily dictating what that solution is. And those solutions that purport to offer an ethical solution. Perhaps a really useful illustration of this tension that we've seen emerging between the second and third wave, because the second wave of the last few years has been the kind of quantitative approaches to fairness. And the third wave has said it is not sufficient to look at simply improving the technical aspects of your system. You need to consider the context within which it's deployed and the communities that it will be deployed against or who will be most affected by it. And a really great example or a way to illustrate this briefly in the talk is using facial recognition. What you're looking at on the screen is Joy Boylan-Winnie, an MIT media researcher, an MIT Media Lab researcher and computer scientist. This was her project co-led with Dr. Timnit Gebru of Google's Ethical AI, and also with Deborah Raji as a researcher, that really, even if there was work in computer vision, understanding disparities in identification of faces, I think it would not be controversial to say that Joy Boylan-Winnie's work with Timnit and Deborah really changed the way we talked about facial recognition. It was mainstream news. It led with stories in the New York Times. It forced Amazon and IBM and a number of other commercial computer vision algorithm providers to think about how they trained their computer vision algorithms and the ways that they tested their robustness. Because Joy Boylan-Winnie measured the performance of some commercially available classifiers and determined that they performed less accurately on dark-skinned and particularly dark-skinned female faces. And over the next few years, the computer vision community really started to focus on improving these levels of inaccuracy in computer vision classifiers, which is not exactly the outcome that Joy Boylan-Winnie, Timnit Gebru, researchers like Deborah Raji and others, I saw Monique Mann is on this call. She would definitely say it's bigger than that. It was not really the outcome that they were looking for. It is not, the question is not simply, can we make this system more accurate? It is, who is this system going to affect? And in the case of facial recognition, where one of its most controversial and already widely used applications has been for law enforcement purposes, in a context where Black and Brown communities are already over-policed and over-surveilled, a more accurate facial recognition system that does nothing in a context within which, in parallel, the economic and social factors marginalizing these communities are not addressed, just perpetuates inequalities faced by these communities. And actually, in this context, where now we have systems that can perhaps with increasing accuracy identify faces across a range of geographical spaces, so not just a public park or a high street, but a shopping center or a sports stadium or an airport, the potential for systematic exclusion of individuals from society in ways that far outweigh the original harm that they're purported to have caused is real. So it really led to this tension and this very active debate. I'm sure many of you have followed it, between people like Timnit Gebru and Jan LeCun, about the extent of responsibilities researchers had as computer scientists, as people involved in the development of AI systems, which can really be boiled down to the kind of debate around, well, what are the responsibilities we do have as the designers, commissioners, implementers of these systems, and where do those responsibilities end? And a difference of opinion as to where those responsibilities end. And this is where I wanted to zoom out, because we've just talked about 5 years essentially of ethical AI, this kind of transition from principles to statistical definitions of fairness to talking about these issues in terms of structural inequalities and access to justice and power. And I wanted to kind of reflect on the fact that even though we are having these conversations right now, when we acknowledge that artificial intelligence as a term does not mean any one thing, it is a term that applies to a constellation of technologies that in some way will or are feared to replace human labor. We're kind of talking about a persistent discussion around what responsibilities exist and what they should be in relation to technologies that push the frontiers of what's possible kind of out. So it's not just a 21st century issue, it's a debate that we've been having across a range of disciplines for many years. We could look back to the early 1990s and the late 1980s and pioneers like Batya Friedman, who was one of the co-founders of the field of value-sensitive design, already talking about and forecasting the rise of increasingly sophisticated computing systems that would mimic ideas of human agency and what that meant for designers of those technologies. We also had Batya Friedman and Helen Nissenbaum, who's kind of one of the world's leading privacy scholars, co-authoring papers where they categorized bias in computer systems back in 1996. We can step outside of kind of computer science and HCI's disciplines and look to other disciplines that have been exploring our responsibilities in association with complex systems. System science, a number of philosophers associated with systems science have tried to articulate what it means to ethically reason your responsibilities as someone building, modeling, making decisions about complex systems. And this is a quote that I find myself returning to a lot this year from Charles Churchman, who was a philosopher and systems scientist in 1970, where he said, if a change is justifiably called an improvement, then reflecting on the boundary of analysis of that improvement is essential. Something appearing to be acceptable or desirable given a narrowly defined boundary may not be seen as such if the boundaries are pushed out. And that seems pretty dry, but to me, it really encapsulates the discussion that we're having at the moment in 2020, which is really about setting boundaries around our responsibilities as designers and deployers of technology, and the ways in which we use the information that we think is relevant to help us understand whether we believe that what we're doing is improvement. So to use that transition from second to third wave ethical AI in the language of this kind of idea of boundary critique, if you limit your boundary of analysis to the technical limitations of your system, what it is that you can fix about it as a system, can I make it more accurate, but can I also make it less biased at the same time? If you just limit your boundary to that technical system, then you can say, well, I've improved it. It is now more accurate whilst also being less fair. If you extend your boundary of analysis out to say, well, I have a more accurate, less biased system, but it is going to be used overwhelmingly on certain kinds of communities, that may change your analysis as to whether your improvement is an improvement or not. So I find the kind of ethics of boundary judgments, boundary critiques, another really useful way of talking about what our responsibilities are, that we've been doing in a number of disciplines, systems science, because it has influenced systems engineering, mechatronics, systems thinking, Donella Meadows, ways of thinking about what our responsibilities are. It would be remiss of me not to mention cybernetics, given I work at the 3A Institute and we have a Masters of Applied Cybernetics. I don't know about many of you, but before joining 3AI, I knew nothing about cybernetics, and it really, frankly, sounded like a very strange term. But having read deeply into cybernetics over the last year, I've become completely enamored with what was essentially a transdisciplinary phenomenon in the 1940s and 50s, and attributed as one of the precursors to AI, cybernetics was all about studying the relationship between, it was man and machine, and their environment. Looking at, you cannot study technical systems in isolation, particularly when in the context within which cybernetics was founded, they were just coming out of World War II and looking at new kinds of learning, self-acting systems, like self-guided missile systems that could be deployed without human intervention, and asking, how do you design those systems safely and responsibly? Norbert Wiener, who you can see in the image there, he was the incredibly eccentric and charismatic, opinionated founder of cybernetics. One of the rumors as to the founding of the artificial intelligence agenda at Dartmouth in the 1950s, I believe the Dartmouth workshop on AI that we attribute as the origins of AI was in 1956, I think. One of the rumors is that he wasn't invited because they didn't want him influencing the agenda too much, because cybernetics already had quite a strong claim. And Wiener himself was a divisive figure. And he was a divisive figure in part because he held incredibly strong convictions as to what the responsibilities and roles of scientists were in relation to the systems that they built. He's quoted as saying, "There's one quality more important than know-how, and that is know-what, by which we determine not only how to accomplish our purposes and what our purposes, but what our purposes are to be." And he was a conscientious objector in the late 1940s and 50s who refused to collaborate further with the military, which I know some of you also are conscientious objectors to your work being used in certain defense or military contexts. And you can imagine, just as it did for you, for him, it excluded him from certain circles of power. Wiener also really anticipated and predicted the effects that the introduction of more automated forms of labor would have on human labor, and was adamant that he wouldn't have a role in designing systems that contributed to selling human labor down the river. And throughout his career, and kind of imbued in the origins of cybernetics, was this sense that you cannot simply look at a system in isolation. You have to look at it in relation to its effect on humans and the physical environment that they operate within. So we could look to cybernetics to see the origins of this debate, this tussle over where our responsibilities end. We can go even further back. We can go back to famous literature. The impoverished reading of Frankenstein that we usually talk about is the Oppenheimer type reading of Frankenstein, where it is the story of a man who has unleashed something powerful in the world and how monstrous it is, and what do we do about it. Another reading of Frankenstein that Jill Lepore, an author and historian in the United States, and others have increasingly argued, is that this is also the story of the abandonment of technology. This is the story of an inventor who, once his invention had been created, ran away from it, ceased taking responsibility for it, did not take on the burden of loving, caring, guiding, articulating the context within which that invention should sit. And so that is another discussion about, well, what is our relationship as inventors of technology? Do our responsibilities stop at the point that we've made the system as best as it can be technically? Or do our responsibilities extend to how we expect it to be in the world, the role that we expect it should have? And, to go even further back, we could go back to some of the foundational knowledge systems and traditions that have been present on our own lands. It's not lost on me that a lot of the principles that we're starting to invoke in artificial intelligence, like principles of participatory design, principles of community ownership, of infrastructure, of data, principles of sustainability, have themselves been part of Indigenous data sovereignty movements for 30 years, and are notions that are part of Indigenous knowledge systems. And that in a number of areas of science, we're starting to look to those ideas of sustainability, responsible custodianship for not only technical objects, but communities and physical environments, we're starting to look back to these traditions and perhaps recognize that those are traditions that are grounded in the wisdom of having been on the earth for 65,000 years and have been seen civilizations that we perhaps don't know existed rise and fall, that perhaps this kind of sustainable, responsible, integrated way of designing technologies is a sign of maturity and not, as perhaps it was called in the 18th and 19th, 20th century, a sign of immaturity or lack of progress. We are actually the young ones. So it is clear that this discussion around, well, like, what are our responsibilities? What should they be? Has been going on for a long time. And actually, when I think of it in that context, what we've been doing over the last few years has given me incredible hope. Last night, I was talking to one of my colleagues, Johan Michaelov, here at the 3A Institute about how I wanted to wrap up this talk. I was like, I want to talk about how actually there are interdependencies between each of these recent waves of AI ethics and ways that they depend on each other. And he said, you should read The Dappled World. I'm not sure if any of you on this call have read it. I took his advice, and last night I at least got through the introduction and chapter 1, but it really very elegantly articulates a view of progress in this area, not as sequentially one after the other, but of being tools and experiences and perspectives that we use as they benefit us and in ways that improve the way we think about a particular issue. Leading with principles and values made fairness and bias issues to be addressed in the technical community, focusing on the technical aspects, the ways in which these systems can be improved, helps us think about what that fails to account for. And I just have this quote here from her where she looks primarily at physics and economics, that we choose from one occasion to another the kinds of problems we're trying to solve and the kinds of techniques we are trying to use. And some of the reflections that I've had thinking about where we're going to go next is that in some areas, enduring principles inform professionalization. I know professionalization of computer science has been an increasing topic of debate. Arvind Narayanan has been writing and talking about it for some time. But I look to professions like the statistics profession. I'm acutely aware that I'm speaking as part of a center of excellence for mathematics and statistics, but in both incredibly positive ways and in some contexts, bane of my life ways, having worked with a number of statisticians in different countries, the weight of codes of practice, the structures that statisticians sit within, force them to think about their responsibilities not only to the accurate production of statistics, so ensuring their statistical products are as good as they can be, but care in how they're represented, how they can be misused, are very much part of how the profession has evolved today. It drives me, frankly, absolutely wild. I know I've ranted to a number of you about this in different contexts, that we have in computer science imported a number of statistical techniques as part of machine learning without necessarily importing some of the values and structures and attentiveness to process and responsibilities that are part of the statistics profession. So I'm really optimistic as to how we can continue to learn from professions like this as we mature in computer science, because it is still an incredibly young industry. I'm also really excited, frankly, about fairness techniques in machine learning, not as solutions to problems. I do not think, as I think, a lot of people are discussing, it is not that this is a problem to be solved, but one benefit that we have had from the last few years and the fact that many of our services are digitally oriented now is that we can measure the effects of systems on communities in much more quantifiable ways than ever before. So it gives us new ways to excavate potential problems with the systems that we have. It doesn't necessarily help us solve those problems, but it gives us a way to identify and articulate that those problems exist. And And it's also quite clear, particularly in 2020, that changing expectations of us as designers and deployers of technology and of the role technologies play in our lives will bring about that structural change. Usually when I hear most of the conversations about structural change are framed in terms of, well, what is the role for regulation? What is the role for legislation? And the way that we devise new kinds of regulation is as part of the democratic process, which involves an invoking of those values and expectations as to how our technologies should be designed in future. So we're kind of pulling back to those principles, those values, and some of the things that we've tried already to help us articulate what that structural change should be. So moving forward, there's three particular areas that we've been researching a bit here at 3AI that I'm really interested in. There are many others. I know many of you are doing work in this area as well. There's so much that I haven't touched on. Something that we've been looking at here at 3AI, this is specifically around fairness techniques, is one of the challenges that we've observed is in moving from theorizing and experimenting with measures of fairness to trying to apply them in complex settings. So we're talking about settings with large legacy organizations, using systems that involve multiple levels of infrastructure, multiple kinds of contributions, is that while it is technically easy to identify that a form of disparity exists in the output of a system, say it is a system recommending products to customers, or it is a system scoring you for health insurance, while we can apply these measures to tell us whether some bias exists, and we have solutions that could potentially help us fix those errors as outputs, figuring out exactly how those happened is really under-researched, because the how they happened is usually not just technical. It is a mix of priorities in a business. It is a mix of regulatory constraints imposed on how they can weight certain variables, what kinds of things can be included. It is all of these human and bureaucratic and environmental factors shaping the design of that system in the first place. But because that is all invisible, it is very hard to move from here is the form of disparity that I know exists to here is our way of changing the problem so it doesn't occur again. And that is not necessarily, I think, a lot of the research under explainable AI at the moment, which looks at what a system is doing, so articulating what is being done. This is kind of the human bit underneath that, which is the, well, why is the what the way the what is? So that's something that we're looking at, like, can we classify that? Can we put a structure around that? What tools can we use to make that more explicit as part of the design of systems? I'm also adamant, having worked on data governance and policy for a long time, that still our approach to data governance is around inputs and outputs. It's if you have certain kind of data, you should do these things with it. And if you don't, you should do these other things. And increasingly, I think we're going to have to look at forms of regulation that are about constraining behaviors, or if you are going to use this data for this purpose, if you're going to say that it is a proxy for someone's likelihood of getting diabetes, you must be sure of that to this extent. So moving away from looking at data as an input or an output to looking at, well, if you have hold of these precious information sources, what are your responsibilities in terms of how you use them and communicate them? And I just wanted to also acknowledge that we're a very young industry. Computing is only a little over 75 years old. I am not young anymore. Adrian and I were having a discussion earlier about how I still look like a teenager. Thank you, Adrian. I'm sure I'll be happy with that when I'm a little bit older. But I'm really not. I'm an older millennial. I have a mortgage. I have one child and another one on the way. And that even the values that I have, which are kind of in the evolution of the web, are themselves not fixed values. I think up until recently, the values we associated with the web were those very open, anti-establishment, neo-libertarian values that really arose from a particular time and place, which is the US and Silicon Valley. And already you can see different geographical regions splintering away from those values. We talk about a European internet with European values. And we also have an emerging generations who have their own values, and then huge amounts of research starting to be generated about how they will shape the future design of AI systems and how they could look entirely different from the ones that we design now. So I just wanted to kind of put that future end on that future note. And that's where I'll end because it's 12:47. I already went a few minutes over, but I really wanted to leave time for questions. Thank you. And I hope that was useful.
Ellen, that was fantastic. I'm so glad there are thoughtful people like you working in this area. And it's really nice to hear that you're optimistic about this. That's something I'll take from this. We've already got a heap of questions. So the first one's quite a nice one. What inspired you to get into the intersection of AI, tech and ethics? Was there a turning point in your life or major news event?
Oh, Kevin, my answer is going to be so disappointing. I feel like I just stumbled into it. In Made by Humans, I talk about the only job I could get after starting university was running the Australian Digital Alliance, which was, I just started working in digital rights. So became very invested in these issues. And that's just how it's been since. So
There's nothing wrong with randomness. Randomness is a good thing. We should embrace it. Okay, here's an interesting one. Your comment on coughing reminded me of new work on monitoring current and future pandemics via AI-powered analysis of cough. One of the ethical concerns of that research being that it would involve an expansion of the public health surveillance. How do we as citizens overcome structural power imbalances to have a voice in how our data is used and how trade-offs of public good versus privacy are decided?
See, some colleagues and I were talking specifically about the analysis of cough study just last week. And it was exactly this kind of study that I was thinking of in saying we need to change our focus from inputs and outputs like information. How are we going to protect access to our coughing data, for example, and instead really push it back on people announcing the results of studies like that. Because one of the things that I just found really frustrating in the reporting around it is this was still one study. It had a relatively small sample size of coughs. They acknowledged that they hadn't yet validated the results, but it was still talked about in the world's media in terms of, I think the accuracy level they put on it was 95% or 98% accuracy in identifying COVID in asymptomatic coughs. And to me, that was just a really irresponsible communication of the result. You know, particularly in this era when we are we want to believe anything and everything about a technology system. So I feel like at some point we have to say, well, in order to make those claims, what is the level of robustness your results should have, so that then we can start talking about these issues like public health surveillance. The fact that I think we go straight to, should we get more data about people? We're still missing does this system even purport to do what we say it does? And how easy should it be to use that coughing data for those purposes in the first place? So we kind of still miss the human engineering component. So yeah, that's my perspective on that.
Yeah.
I think it's all about designers.
Right, yeah, there's a question later on about the responsibilities of researchers, but yeah, it seems like it's about that. Researchers need to do a bit more of these checks before they release this stuff. And of course the media just laps it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, you talked about Fairlean as a toolkit for assessing and improving fairness in AI. Can you comment on the connections and disconnections between fairness and fairness as in findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable?
So this is purely from an outsider's perspective, having been part of both discussions around fair data and fairness, that they don't seem to really intersect at all. Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data is really about certain technical qualities associated with the data that we use. Interestingly, fair data doesn't really get at questions like the quality of curation of data or the reliability of it doesn't kind of go to those more qualitative questions. So I would say they're still quite disconnected. And I feel like FAIR as an acronym for fair data is actually almost a misnomer. It's not really, I mean, it's about, I guess, fair access, but not fairness in the way that we talk about fair AI.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time that an acronym has been unhelpful. So, Ellen, ethical AI dilemma has been around ever since the first Turing machine. However, I humbly submit that the last decade since 2010 has exacerbated the issue as the combination of big data availability and processing at scale and the power of distributed computing, social media mean that the current era is the most important time for this discussion.
Kevin, I agree with you. That's kind of, I think, where my optimism comes from is yes, we've been talking about these issues for a long time, but now, you know, we are in situations where the computing systems that surround us affect our lives in very tangible, real ways because of scale, because of distributed computing, because of digital connectivity. So the need to act on them is much greater.
Right. Is anyone doing any thinking about how the CARE, here's another acronym, about the CARE principles, collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility and ethics, and thank you for spelling out that acronym, for Indigenous data governance apply to the development and adoption of more acronyms, AI, ML?
If anyone is doing this thinking, it would be someone like Angie Abdillah, who's one of the founders of Old Ways is the founder and is heavily involved in kind of Indigenous AI and ethical AI. I have no doubt that she and people that she's associated with are drawing on these, and it just made me think, I haven't heard of those principles yet, and I probably should look into them.
Okay, I like your comments on expanding the boundaries of our ethical considerations, but how do we force expansion of those boundaries when the design of technologies often seems siloed away to technical domains and experts?
So one of the reflections I had whilst I was writing this talk is all of the boundary stuff that I put into this, the systems science, the cybernetics, the literature, Indigenous knowledge systems, all really can be directly attributed to having been at 3AI for the last year. I don't mean like 3AI, but the fact that I have been surrounded by very diverse disciplines and cultural backgrounds who will usually answer any statement I make with, yeah, that sounds like this separate thing over here that you don't know exists yet, but has always existed. So I think it sounds trite to say, we always talk a lot about multidisciplinary teams and diverse teams, but they really do force a reassessment of your boundaries of analysis. And I think there are some beautiful examples of that multidisciplinary, but not only multidisciplinary, but kind of multi-backgrounds. At 3AI, we're not just academics, we're in my case, I feel I shouldn't even be able to use the term academic because I've only been here for 12 months, but I have a lot of industry and government experience. So it's kind of beyond just disciplinary interaction, but also kind of fields of application. So I think that mix of skills is part of it. I also think, again, this is old news, but is so true, is like an appreciation for history, not even necessarily ethics, but an appreciation for history as part of a technical education can just go a long way to helping you place what you're doing in context.
Yeah, and I noted you talking about participatory design earlier. Yeah, and that's been a theme in health and medical research recently. When I started out, you never talked to patients, but now there are journals where you're even forced to have a section on, did you talk to patients and what did they say before this, which is, yeah, actually been enlightening for me.
Mm.
Okay, ethical frameworks have been attractive for governments to respond to issues around AI are identified. Specifically, there have been a focus novel risks that individuals or organisations do not have the capacity to. When should governments look to regulate AI rather than rely on a normative approach? And which areas of AI lend themselves to the application of regulation?
I'm going to give a very political answer and say it depends. I know that Ed Santow and the Australian Human Rights Commission has been looking at where our human rights law framework is sufficient for regulating certain applications of AI and where it's not. I think that some of the ways that we use AI will just be brought under or tested through, I should say, tested through existing legal infrastructure. I also think again, I know I sound like a broken record, it's not about regulating AI as in technologies. It's about regulating the organizations, the humans, the context within which AI is used. So I think we will still have more work to do on setting expectations for ourselves as an industry, ourselves as organizations using AI. For example, facial recognition is clearly a live topic at the moment. In the UK Court of Appeals earlier this year, the UK Court of Appeals prohibited the use of facial recognition by law enforcement on high streets under certain conditions. There will be applications that are themselves up for regulation as well. But yeah, I think it's like, don't focus on the technology, it's focus on the way that we shape ourselves as a profession and context using these technologies.
All right, and there's a great flow-on question to that. Do you strongly believe the day will come when data scientists and software engineers alike will have to take an oath similar to the Hippocratic Oath in the healthcare profession? And if so, do you believe it's possible to control via regulation or otherwise the inherent human biases that pervade AI development?
Someone might disagree. In fact, Adrian, you probably disagree with me here, but I'm like, the way the healthcare profession looks today is not because of the existence of the Hippocratic Oath. It is not that there is an oath that is so dominant in the medical profession that it curtails and kind of regulates practices. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath existed when we were doing experiments on humans during World War II. It was around during the Tuskegee syphilis studies. It's been around during the forced sterilization of people with disabilities and Indigenous women. What I think, the day I think will come for data scientists and software engineers, as it did for the healthcare profession and still does, this is still an industry in progress, is that we will say, what accountability structures that do we need that are more than just taking an oath? When should you no longer be able to practice your profession? When is an error so egregious as to warrant further penalty? And that is kind of very much the ongoing discussion that we have in the medical profession even today, is like, what are the extents of those responsibilities? Usually via licensing and regulation, patient changes. So I kind of think the Hippocratic Oath is really famous and we talk about it all the time, but that's not what's changed the healthcare profession.
No, I mean, look, I'll just briefly add two things I would like to see are strong protection for whistleblowers, because they often uncover some of the worst patterns, but often end up at a huge personal cost to themselves. And I'm a big fan of random auditing. I think if people know that they could be checked, that encourages good behavior. Okay, we're still going, and thank you for leaving so much time for questions. Do you think areas of research like XAI and trustworthy AI are going to help solve ethical issues?
I'm sorry, Charlotte, I'm not going to give a very satisfying answer, which is such a I think they are like this dappled world metaphor that Nancy Cartwright uses. They're going to help us figure out how we solve them. So it's not that everything in them is going to end up being used in applied settings, but through this process of research and learning from others, we will figure out what the really enduring aspects of those areas will be. So I think they could.
I'm going to skip that one because it's just a comment, but a nice one. So regarding the study of causes for ethical biases at 3AI, have you published reviews of the studies for us to further review?
I'm not sure which bit of the talk Kim would be talking about there. Oh, this is the fairness work that we talked about that we're investigating at the moment. Not yet. We are really hopeful to in 2021. It's underway.
All right. So we're out of time, but can I quickly whip through these last three questions? We'll give short answers.
Sure.
All right. This is a long one. Let's go through. Considering the way the pandemic is progressing in your native UK, the rest of Europe and the US too, do you believe there is a greater case for Western governments to share more data with citizens, even at the possible intrusion and invasion of privacy, to prevent the spread of the virus?
Kevin, I don't know whether to be pleased or shocked that you think I'm from the UK when I'm a native Western Australian and now trying to thicken my accent as much as possible. I would actually like to see governments share more data about themselves and about their operations and their infrastructure to help us mitigate the spread of the virus. I think part of public health surveillance is that we share information about ourselves for contact tracing. I do think there's a lot more, though, that governments can also share about testing rates. Australia, I think, is pretty good at some of those high-level statistics, but I believe there is a greater case for more open government data about government.
Oh, good. What are your thoughts about the role of regulation of AI in industry? For example, most large banks and financial institutions in Australia are now working with AI to support decision-making around loans, but there's little explicit regulatory guidance about this in Australia, unlike in Singapore.
So I think this is a useful illustration of the point that I was trying to make earlier, which is because AI is no one thing, and so therefore it means when you're trying to define it in regulatory terms, it can be really hard. Like we could be talking about deep neural nets. We could be talking about relatively straightforward statistical models. I know that some people talked about robo-debt as an AI system when it was more just an automated system. Instead, I think if you focus on in what context decision-making is occurring and with what tools, you can get to much more robust regulatory guidance. So I think perhaps it's better framed as where you are using an automated tool to make a loan and where in question is the kind of level of human intervention in a variety of ways. Like when that is in question, that's where your regulatory guidance comes in, not necessarily because it does or does not invoke AI, whatever AI means.
Right, and last short one, and then we'll let you go, Alan, and thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for these great questions. I'm working in digital learning environments. What is your take on human agency and in online learning environments?
Having spent the last, 8 months now teaching in an online learning environment, when I talked about the generations that are kind of come after us who are now experiencing these online learning environments, I wonder how much they are going to change the way we design online learning environments now, because at the moment, I would say there's very little agency in a number of contexts for students to shape proctoring as it occurs, for example, checks for plagiarism, ways of monitoring our engagement with resources for learning purposes. I know UTS is doing some really interesting and fascinating work in online learning environments, invoking AI in different ways. I think the level of agency participants in that have is something that we will continue to revisit over the next 25 years, because I would say a lot of students this year have found them unsatisfactory.
Well, Ellen, thank you. That's been fantastic. My only disappointment is you didn't share that lovely example that you did on Twitter the other day of the AI camera that confused the bald linesman's head with the board. That was a brilliant AI fail. So I recommend everybody follow on Ellen for little gems like that.
Yeah, there are so many. I could do just a whole talk around hilarious AI gaffes and why we shouldn't be afraid.
Okay, we're going to book you for that. Ellen, thank you, and thank you everybody for attending. And yeah, look on the ASIN's website to see the recording.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Adrian and Rosanna, again.